Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Adaeze had always believed that love, though not always perfect, could be beautiful when rooted in loyalty and honesty. She and Chuka had been together for 3 years, weathering the storms of financial hardship and the uncertainties of life as young adults struggling to find their footing in a chaotic city like Lagos. Their relationship wasn't built on wealth or social status, but rather on late-night conversations, shared laughter in their tiny one-room apartment, and the small sacrifices that kept them connected. Adaeze would wake up at 4 a.m. to cook for Chuka so he could have food before heading off to his security job. And Chuka, though often distracted, always made sure to surprise her with little acts of kindness, like handwritten notes on her pillow or sneaking in her favorite meat pie after work. Even when money was tight, they found joy in their simplicity. They were two dreamers who held each other through life storms, and Adaeze truly believed they were building a future together. But one flaw stood out in Chuka, a flaw Adaeze had convinced herself she could live with. He was a chronic flirt. At first, it was harmless. Chuka had a charming smile and a smooth tongue, so Adaeze assumed his friendly nature was just part of who he was. But it wasn't long before she started noticing the little signs, the late replies to messages, the mysterious calls he would take in the bathroom, and the constant locking of his phone. When she confronted him about it, he would always deflect with a joke or blame her for being insecure. He would kiss her forehead, tell her she was overthinking, and she, against her better judgment, would let it go. Her heart trusted him, but her mind screamed otherwise. Still, she stayed, not because she was weak, but because she remembered every sacrifice they had made together. And whenever she felt like walking away, she turned to Pamela, her best friend since secondary school, who always told her to be patient and reminded her that men changed when loved deeply enough. Pamela had always been a constant in Adaeze's life, her sister in everything but blood. They shared secrets, clothes, dreams, and heartbreaks. Whenever Adaeze cried about Chuka's suspicious behaviors, Pamela would hold her tightly and whisper words of encouragement like, "You deserve the best, but don't give up too soon. No one is perfect." Adaeze never imagined that the same person she ran to would someday be the one she needed to run from. Pamela would always say things like, "Men will always be men," and Adaeze thought she meant it to comfort her. But she never noticed the way Pamela looked at Chuka when he walked into the room, or the way her voice changed when he was near. Pamela was good at pretending. And Adaeze, blinded by love and loyalty, never imagined betrayal could come from both sides of her heart. The months rolled by, and Adaeze tried to silence her instincts. Each time she found something suspicious, a lipstick-stained napkin in Chuka's bag, flirtatious comments under his photos, or unknown girls calling him late at night, she swallowed her doubts and chose to forgive. It wasn't because she lacked strength, but because she believed that forgiveness was proof of love. She was terrified of starting over. She didn't want to admit that she had invested years in a man who might never change. And every time she stood at the edge of breaking up with Chuka, Pamela would pull her back. Pamela had a way of making Adaeze feel seen, like she truly understood the burden she carried. "You think another man will love you like Chuka?" Pamela once asked. "Men these days only want quick pleasure. Chuka may flirt, but he chose you. That must mean something." Those words clung to Adaeze's soul, manipulating her into shrinking her pain and adjusting her expectations. What Adaeze didn't know was that Pamela had already started crossing the boundaries. It began subtly, inviting Chuka for drinks when Adaeze was unavailable, tagging him in posts that only lovers should share, and posting cryptic captions like "Real one's vibe" on a different frequency. Adaeze, overwhelmed with her hairdressing job and trying to save up for her own salon, was too exhausted to notice the red flags. She trusted Pamela blindly. Even when someone hinted that Pamela was getting too close to Chuka, Adaeze laughed it off. "Pamela? Never. She knows everything we've been through." But behind closed doors, Chuka had started slipping away, emotionally and physically. He became more impatient, always glued to his phone, and more irritable when Adaeze asked questions. He no longer made the little gestures she used to love. The man who once called her my peace now made her feel like a burden. Yet she held on, because letting go felt like losing a part of herself. Then came the night that shattered her. She was scrolling through her social media when she saw it, a photo of Pamela and Chuka at a beach resort. He was holding her waist, and Pamela had captioned it, "Some connections are just meant to happen." At first, Adaeze thought it was an old picture or maybe a mistake. But when she called Pamela, she didn't pick. Chuka didn't answer either. Hours later, Pamela sent a text, "I'm sorry, but I had to follow my heart." That text broke Adaeze in places she didn't know could hurt. She stared at it, shaking, her tears soaking her dress. The pain wasn't just about losing a man, it was the betrayal of someone she trusted with her whole soul. Her best friend, her sister, the one she defended even when people warned her. The realization hit her harder than anything she had ever felt. The two people she loved most had chosen each other, leaving her to rot in the ruins they built. Adaeze didn't eat for days. Her room became a tomb, filled with echoes of laughter, framed pictures, and memories that now felt like poison. Friends reached out, but she ignored them. She deleted her business page online and closed her shop temporarily. Clients began to fade, and Adaeze didn't care. Life had lost its flavor. She often stared blankly at the walls, wondering how things went so wrong. Was she not beautiful enough? Not smart enough? Did she love too hard? She replayed every memory, every moment Chuka said he loved her, every time Pamela told her not to give up. She felt like a fool. The nights were the worst. She would wake up crying, her chest heavy, as if grief had sat directly on her ribs. She thought of ending it all sometimes, but the tiny flicker of hope in her soul refused to let her go. One rainy night, Adaeze stepped outside barefoot, allowing the cold water to wash over her skin. As she looked at the clouds, she whispered a vow, "I will never let them break me." It was the first time she spoke in days, and her voice startled even herself. That vow didn't heal her immediately, but it gave her a reason to breathe again. Slowly, she returned to work, though her clients noticed her spark was gone. She no longer smiled easily, and her jokes had dried up. But she was there, trying. That was all that mattered. One day, while cleaning her salon floor after a long, quiet day, she found an old notebook where she had once scribbled dreams, opening a beauty spa, learning business management, mentoring girls. She stared at it for minutes, then began writing again. Not for anyone else, just for her. Each stroke of her pen was a step toward reclaiming her identity. But life wasn't done testing her. Just when she had begun to crawl back to the surface, she received news that Chuka and Pamela had moved in together and were now working at a reputable firm, the same one where Chuka had once said he could never belong. Adaeze felt the sting again, but this time it didn't shatter her. It angered her. All she had given him, the meals, the sacrifices, the loyalty, he now offered another woman without shame. But deep down, she didn't want him back. What hurt was how easily he replaced her, and how Pamela, the one who once held her hand during heartbreaks, became the thief of her joy. Adaeze was done crying. Her pain had now fermented into quiet determination. She didn't know how, but one day they would both remember her name, not as a girl who was broken, but as a woman they could never break again. Adaeze didn't think the pain could get any worse, but it did. Betrayal, when it comes from strangers, is tolerable. But when it comes from the people you once laughed with, cried to, and bled for, it leaves scars too deep to explain. Adaeze tried to hold herself together, but she felt like a house without a foundation, cracked, collapsing, beyond repair. Pamela had blocked her on social media, and Chuka didn't even offer a word of explanation. Not even a lie. The silence was louder than bullets. Every picture they posted together seemed like a direct stab to her memory. It was like watching someone else live the life she built, sleep in the bed she prayed over, and laugh with the man she once called her future. But what shattered her most was the laughter. Pamela laughed like she had never known Adaeze's pain, and Chuka smiled like she had never fed him, housed him, or held him through joblessness. They had buried her, but she was still breathing. She tried to delete the memories. She deleted every picture, burned old letters, packed his shirts into a bag, and gave them away. But memory doesn't live in phones or clothes. It lives in the little things. The way her hand reached out in the middle of the night, still expecting his chest to be there. The scent of his perfume on the towel she forgot to wash. The playlist they used to sing along to during chores. Everything around her became a weapon. Her own home turned into a war zone. Days turned to nights, and nights turned to morning. Mourning a friendship that died without a funeral and a love that died without closure. And in those moments, she hated herself more than she hated them. Hated herself for trusting too easily, for confiding in a snake, for fighting alone in a battle that two people abandoned long ago, for loving blindly. But she was too tired to be angry. Pain had drained every emotion from her. Now all that was left was silence, loud, lonely, and cruel. Eventually, Adaeze stopped going out altogether. She turned down clients, isolated herself, and lived on biscuits and soda for days. Bills piled up. Landlord began knocking. And yet she couldn't summon the strength to care. Her salon was abandoned. Her hair products expired. Her dream was on life support. But even as everything crumbled, she refused to return to Chuka. People gossiped, asking how a woman like her could lose a man to her best friend. Some said she wasn't sweet enough. Others said she must have done something to deserve it. Their whispers added salt to her wounds. But she said nothing. Because what could she say? That she gave her all, and it still wasn't enough? That the people she loved most fed her to the wolves and called it fate? So she endured, with bloodshot eyes, hollow cheeks, and a trembling soul. And as she lay in bed one night, staring at the cracked ceiling, she whispered to herself, "Let them think I'm finished. One day, this same pain will build me." Time has a way of moving, even when you want it to freeze. Days became weeks, and Adaeze's silence began to feel permanent. Her phone barely rang anymore. Friends stopped checking in. No one wanted to be around sadness that didn't know how to fake a smile. She didn't blame them. People preferred the happy version of you, the version that offered jokes, support, and good vibes. But no one wanted to sit in your darkness and hold your hand through the grief. So she stopped expecting anyone to understand. Her once bubbly neighborhood salon had become a storage room. The mirror she used to smile into as she braided hair now reflected a stranger. Tired eyes, dry lips, and a soul on the edge. Rent was overdue. Electricity had been disconnected. Adaeze now boiled water with charcoal to bathe. But she still refused to borrow money. She still had pride, not arrogance, but quiet pride that came from knowing she was not born to be pitted forever. One Sunday afternoon, her landlord came to embarrass her in front of the compound. He shouted her name, banged her door, and cursed her existence. She opened the door calmly and gave him a look that silenced him mid-sentence. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just told him to give her 2 weeks. He scoffed and walked away, calling her a useless girl. She closed the door behind her and sat on the cold floor, holding her chest like she was holding her breath. The shame was unbearable, but there were no tears left. That same evening, she walked to a nearby supermarket, not to buy anything, but just to breathe different air. She helped an old woman pick up her dropped groceries without expecting a thank you. It was instinct. As she turned to leave, the woman called her back and asked if she needed a job. Adaeze hesitated, not out of pride, but exhaustion. The woman handed her a card and said she might know someone looking for a reliable assistant. It was nothing certain, just a possibility. But for Adaeze, it was enough. A possibility was all she needed. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on her mattress, staring at the card like it held a key to life itself. For the first time in months, she felt something other than pain. It was fear, but not the fear of failure. The fear of hope. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but something inside her said this was not ordinary. The next day, she put on her cleanest outfit, tied her hair neatly, and went to the address on the card. It was a corporate building, tall, glassy, and intimidating. She almost turned back. She wasn't sure what scared her more, being rejected or being accepted. But she forced herself to go in. The receptionist was polite and told her to wait. Hours passed. She wanted to leave, but stayed. When she was finally called into the office, she didn't expect to see a young, sharply dressed man, stern, focused, but kind-eyed. "I hear you help someone I care about," he said simply. "I like people who do good even when life is unfair." That was how Adaeze met Mr. Emeka Nwosu, and unknowingly, how her story began to turn. Working under Mr. Emeka Nwosu wasn't easy. He was meticulous, organized, and didn't believe in second chances. But he also had a quiet kindness that reminded Adaeze of what respect felt like. Her first few days were filled with tension. She made mistakes, missed a file deadline, dropped coffee on a report once. But Emeka never shouted. He would sigh, glance at her with disappointment, and say, "Try again." And she always did. She began waking up earlier than she ever had before. She ironed her clothes with care, walked to work to save money, and read every company document she could find. She knew she was at the bottom, and she embraced it, because she knew where she was coming from, and she wasn't going back. She kept her past locked away, never mentioning Chuka or Pamela, never discussing her salon or former life. She just worked in silence, in humility, in determination. And slowly, her life began to breathe again. She started earning regularly, enough to pay off her debt and get her light reconnected. She bought a new mattress, stocked her kitchen with real food, and began reviving her skin and body. She would often look at her reflection and not recognize herself, not because she looked different, but because she felt different. She wasn't that girl who begged to be loved anymore. She was a woman who had touched rock bottom and survived. In the office, Emeka began to notice her, not just her efficiency, but her grace under pressure. She was never loud, never boastful, but her presence was commanding. Clients requested to speak with her. Junior staff came to her for advice. She didn't chase influence, she attracted it. And though Emeka said little, he observed everything. Her quiet strength fascinated him. There were times he would watch her from his office window, how she spoke to people with patience, how she wrote with clarity, how she smiled with restraint. She was different. Not just hard-working. She had suffered and survived, and it showed. One evening, after everyone had gone, Adaeze was still at her desk finishing a report. Emeka walked up to her with a coffee in hand. "You work too hard," he said. She looked up, startled, unsure if it was a compliment or a complaint. He smiled softly. "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who believed in building from nothing." That was the first time he said something personal. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. He placed the coffee on her desk and walked away. Adaeze stared at the cup for a long time. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a door opening. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel forgotten. Something was changing, slowly, quietly. And she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. Ready to rebuild. Ready to rise. And someday, when fate came full circle, she would be more than just remembered. She would be revered. Life began to settle into something close to peace for Adaeze, though nothing about her journey so far had been peaceful. She still walked to work to save money, still lived modestly in her small apartment, and still avoided public places where she might run into old faces. But there was now a quiet rhythm to her existence, a sense of control she hadn't known in years. Each day, she clocked in before sunrise, handled administrative duties with military precision, and was often the last to leave the office. Her loyalty was unquestionable. Her diligence spoke louder than any self-promotion ever could. Yet behind her strong exterior, there was still a scarred woman. Sometimes she would find herself crying at night for no reason at all, not because she wanted Chuka back, but because betrayal never really disappears. It just softens into a dull ache that resurfaces when you least expect it. Even in her new world, her past still had a grip on her. But then came a test she didn't expect. A phone call from an old friend who warned her that Chuka and Pamela had returned from a short vacation and were working together at a company owned by one of Emeka's subsidiaries. The news struck Adaeze with a strange, confusing force. part of her wanted to confront them, scream at them, or at least make them feel the pain they caused. But another part of her felt indifferent, as though she had finally detached from the wound. Still, she couldn't ignore the irony. The same man who once told her that people like Emeka were untouchable was now, unknowingly, beneath the roof she now served under. Fate, it seemed, had a strange sense of humor. Adaeze didn't speak of it to anyone, not even to Emeka. But a fire began to burn inside her, not of revenge, but of validation. She didn't need to destroy them. She just needed to rise high enough that their memory would become irrelevant. That night, Adaeze sat on her balcony, staring at the moon. The breeze felt like comfort, like the universe trying to reassure her that something bigger was ahead. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream again. Not just about surviving, but thriving. She took out her old notebook and scribbled new goals. Take a course in business communication. Save for a new apartment. Start my own side brand someday. They were just words, but they gave her purpose. Her pain had pushed her into survival mode for so long that she had forgotten how to dream freely. But now, as the stars blinked above her like little reminders of hope, Adaeze whispered a prayer, not for revenge, not for Chuka's downfall, but for strength. Strength to become so complete that no betrayal could break her again. She didn't know it yet, but the crossroads she stood on would soon become the turning point of her destiny. A week later, something shifted at the office. Mr. Emeka called Adaeze into his office, a rare occurrence, as most of their interactions happened over brief hallway updates or email correspondence. She entered, heart pounding, unsure if she had done something wrong. But Emeka didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful, almost intrigued. "Sit," he said gently, gesturing to the chair across from him. He stared at her for a moment before speaking again. "How long have you been with us now?" She answered softly, 7 months, sir." He nodded. "And yet in those 7 months, I've watched you rebuild systems, retain clients, and inspire staff, without a single complaint or request." Adaeze didn't know what to say. No one had ever acknowledged her hard work with such sincerity. Emeka leaned back in his chair. "There's an opening on our strategy and client relations team. It's not an assistant role. It's managerial. And I want you to take it." Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought she misheard. But Emeka was serious. He slid a file toward her, a formal offer. "This is not a favor," he clarified. "You earned this. Your loyalty, discretion, and performance have been impeccable. And to be honest, I've never seen anyone recover from such visible wounds with the kind of grace you've shown." Adaeze's eyes watered slightly, but she blinked fast. She wouldn't cry, not here. She took the offer letter with trembling hands and nodded. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "I won't disappoint you." Emeka smiled faintly. "I know." As she left the office, her legs felt light, as though she were walking on air. Her colleagues noticed her expression and tried to guess what had happened, but Adaeze said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't boast. She just walked back to her desk and resumed work like usual, except now, her heart beat with new power. This was more than a promotion. It was a reminder that she was still worthy, still seen, still rising. That night, Adaeze bought herself a modest plate of jollof rice and chicken, something she hadn't splurged on in months, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. Her heart was full, not with pride, but with relief. For so long, she thought her goodness had been wasted, her loyalty a weakness. But now it was being rewarded. She thought of Pamela and Chuka, not with bitterness, but with peace. They had stolen her peace once, but they would never do it again. She no longer lived in their shadow. She was stepping into a light of her own making. And though the road ahead would still be tough, Adaeze had tasted something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. And once you've tasted hope, it's hard to go back to being broken. Adaeze's new role came with fresh responsibilities, but she embraced them like someone who had been starved of purpose. Early mornings became even earlier. Her outfits changed. She now wore fitted blazers, sensible heels, and confidence like perfume. She learned to hold meetings, present strategies, and close deals without doubting her worth. The boardroom that once intimidated her now became her stage. Even Emeka began to change around her. He no longer addressed her as Miss Adaeze, but simply Adaeze. He would pause during meetings to ask her opinions, would glance at her during tense discussions like she was his compass. Others in the company began to notice. Some whispered that she had caught the boss's eye, but she ignored them. Let them talk. They hadn't seen her sleeping on bare mattresses, hadn't heard her crying into her pillow when her world collapsed. She had paid her dues, not in favors, but in fire. Chuka didn't appear immediately. It took weeks before he showed up, during a partnership review meeting between the head office and the subsidiary where he now worked. Adaeze didn't know he would be there. She walked into the conference room, documents in hand, and froze for half a second when she saw him. He looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually. The arrogance was gone. His eyes darted nervously when he saw her. Pamela wasn't there. Adaeze composed herself, took her seat beside Emeka, and acted like Chuka was just another staff member. During the meeting, she spoke with clarity, presented projections, and impressed everyone in the room. Emeka was visibly proud. Chuka, on the other hand, couldn't look her in the eyes. After the meeting, he lingered in the hallway, trying to catch her attention. Adaeze, he finally called. She turned, looked at him for a second, then said politely, "Excuse me, I'm in a hurry." And she walked away, heels clicking like punctuation marks to her silent victory. That night, as Adaeze walked home, she felt lighter than ever. It wasn't just about the job or the suit or the way Chuka looked at her. It was about the fact that she had healed, fully. That seeing him again didn't break her, it empowered her. She remembered the girl who once cried herself to sleep, who once begged God for answers, who once thought she would never smile again. And now here she was, walking into her future with dignity. Life wasn't perfect. The scars were still there, but they no longer hurt. They had become reminders of what she had survived. And she knew deep down that the best was still to come. The gala was one of the company's biggest events, a night of high-level networking, celebration of quarterly growth, and appreciation for loyal clients and staff. Adaeze had never attended one before. In her previous life, galas were for people who could afford to smile publicly, not the broken, not the recovering. But now, she stood in front of the mirror in her one-bedroom apartment, zipping up a deep emerald gown that hugged her body in elegant defiance of everything she'd endured. Her hair, styled in soft waves, cascaded down her back, and her makeup was minimal yet radiant. She didn't look like a survivor anymore. She looked like a woman stepping into the spotlight she had earned. As she slipped on her heels, her hands trembled slightly, not because she feared judgment, but because this was the first time in years she was walking into a room not as someone's ex, not as a shadow, but as herself. The event was grand, held in a luxurious hotel ballroom draped in gold lighting and soft jazz music. Emeka stood at the entrance in a navy blue tuxedo, greeting dignitaries and welcoming clients like the true leader he was. When he saw Adaeze enter, his smile softened. "You clean up well," he said, offering his arm. She smiled nervously and took it. Heads turned as they walked into the ballroom together, and whispers began to spread. But Adaeze didn't care. Her heart was calm, until she spotted Chuka and Pamela near the back of the room. Pamela wore a glittering silver dress, loud and bold as ever, while Chuka looked pale, dressed in an ill-fitting suit. Their eyes locked with Adaeze for a brief moment. She didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile and turned back to her boss. If their presence bothered her, it didn't show. The look on Pamela's face was sour, and Chuka's mouth hung slightly open. They weren't expecting her like this. They weren't ready. Throughout the night, Adaeze remained poised. She spoke eloquently with guests, explained reports with clarity, and charmed clients effortlessly. Emeka never left her side for long. He would occasionally glance at her as if checking to make sure she was still grounded. But Adaeze didn't need grounding. She was rooted now in something deeper than revenge. Toward the end of the night, while getting a drink at the bar, Chuka approached her. "You look different," he muttered. Adaeze raised a brow. "I look like someone you once threw away," she replied calmly. "Only now I know my worth." Chuka lowered his gaze. Pamela, she's not what I thought. Adaeze didn't smile. You were never what I thought either. Then she turned and walked back into the crowd, leaving him frozen, drowning in the irony. That night, as Emeka escorted her out, his hand brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel something again, something soft, something healing. Adaeze had barely recovered from the gala when Emeka summoned her to his private office the following week. She assumed it was about a new project or an internal audit. Instead, he handed her a file. You didn't tell me you knew Chuka and Pamela, he said, his tone unreadable. Adaeze froze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. I didn't think it mattered, she whispered. Emeka leaned back in his chair, arms folded. You're a professional. That much is clear. But this company thrives on transparency. Adaeze's throat tightened. Was this a test? Was she about to lose everything again? They're part of my past, she said slowly. I was engaged to Chuka. Pamela was my best friend. They betrayed me. I lost everything. I rebuilt myself here. That's the only truth that matters. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't flinch. Emeka didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded. That's all I needed to know. But something shifted between them after that. Emeka started watching her more closely, not with suspicion, but with a deeper understanding. He began asking her questions beyond work, about her childhood, her dreams, her scars. Adaeze, though initially guarded, found herself opening up in pieces. She told him about her mother's early death, how she once hawked bread to pay for her education, and how she gave up her first dream of becoming a lawyer because life demanded survival over ambition. Emeka listened, not as a boss, but as a man who saw the weight she carried. And slowly, he shared his own pain, how he lost his wife to cancer, how he buried himself in work to escape loneliness, and how he admired people who didn't let pain turn them cruel. They became more than colleagues. They became companions, quiet, respectful companions, navigating their own ruins with grace. It was on a Friday evening, just as the office lights dimmed and staff hurried out for the weekend, that Emeka walked into Adaeze's office and handed her a small brown envelope. I've nominated you for the Executive Development Program, he said. It's 3 months of mentoring, strategic leadership, and client expansion planning. Adaeze blinked, stunned. But I'm not, he cut her off. You are. Don't let your past convince you otherwise. She stared at him, heart pounding. For a second, all she saw was Chuka, the man who told her she was too emotional to lead anything, who laughed when she mentioned starting her own beauty brand. But Emeka wasn't Chuka. Emeka believed in her. That night, she took the envelope home, placed it on her pillow, and just stared at it. She hadn't yet accepted the opportunity, but a door had opened. And this time, it was leading somewhere her pain could never follow. Pamela couldn't stand it anymore. Every time she saw Adaeze, she felt like vomiting. It wasn't just guilt, it was envy. Pamela had thought that taking Chuka would destroy Adaeze, that she'd crawl into the shadows and stay there. But the exact opposite happened. Pamela had taken Adaeze's man and still lost the war. Chuka was now bitter and broken, constantly comparing her to his ex. He barely touched her anymore. He drank more, slept less, and had started showing interest in another woman at work. Pamela felt the humiliation tightening around her like a noose. And to make things worse, everyone at the office admired Adaeze. Even Mr. Emeka, the same man Pamela had once tried to flirt with, now smiled only at Adaeze. That was the last straw. Pamela decided she would sabotage her. She pulled out an old photo of Adaeze crying on the bathroom floor, a memory from the early days of heartbreak. She forwarded it anonymously to HR, along with a fabricated complaint suggesting Adaeze was emotionally unstable. But Emeka was no fool. The moment he saw the photo, he knew it was meant to provoke, not inform. He summoned the IT department to trace the sender, and within hours, Pamela's name surfaced. He didn't call security. He didn't yell. He simply sent her an email, report to my office at noon. When Pamela arrived, trying to fake confidence, Emeka dropped the photo on the desk between them. You know what disappoints me the most? He asked. Not the betrayal, but the laziness of it. You thought you could break a woman who's already survived the worst. Pamela stuttered, searching for words. She's manipulative. She plays victim. Emeka's face didn't change. You're fired, he said quietly. Not because of the photo, but because I don't keep poison in my company. Pamela stormed out of the building that same day. No teas. No apologies. Just bitterness trailing her like a stench she couldn't wash off. Word spread quickly. Chuka heard about the dismissal and confronted Emeka, only to be given a cold reminder. Focus on your duties, or you'll be next. That night, Adaeze found an envelope on her desk, no sender name, just a note that read, "Thank you for choosing dignity." Inside was a voucher for a weekend getaway and a personal message scribbled in Emeka's handwriting. Sometimes healing begins where revenge ends. Adaeze sat back in her chair, speechless. She had not lifted a finger against Pamela. She had chosen silence over revenge, and yet justice had come to her door. In that moment, she realized something sacred. She was no longer defined by what she lost. She was now defined by how she rose. And even the sky, it seemed, was no longer her limit. It had been only a week since Pamela's dismissal, but the ripple effect lingered in the company like perfume after a storm. Adaeze didn't speak about it. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply continued her work with an unshaken grace that made others admire her even more. The executive program nomination had already made her visible, but Pamela's disgrace turned Adaeze into a silent legend in the office. People whispered about her resilience, her composure, her story, though most only knew fragments of it. Emeka never addressed the incident publicly, but everyone could see the shift. He now took Adaeze along for top client meetings. He often paused during presentations and asked her for her opinion in front of board members. And she delivered, every single time. Her voice had matured into one that demanded attention without ever raising in tone. Her suggestions were sound, her ideas fresh, and her delivery always calm, like someone who had tasted fire and now knew how to carry ice in her veins. The board of directors, a group of rigid men and one older woman who rarely approved anyone outside their inner circle, started paying close attention to her. It wasn't long before Adaeze was offered a new title, Director of Strategic Client Relations, and with it came a private office, a salary leap, and access to company-wide decisions. When she was called in to sign the promotion letter, she simply nodded, took the pen, and signed. No excitement, no disbelief. Only quiet gratitude, because deep down she had already visualized this moment in her prayers, in her solitude, in her tears. Emeka walked her to her new office and stood silently at the doorway as she took it in. He then said, "You remind me of what this company was meant to be, built by strength, not scandal." Adaeze blinked and looked at him. "And you remind me that leaders can still be kind," she replied. Their eyes lingered a little longer than usual. And in that silence, something unspoken bloomed. Later that evening, Chuka entered her office without knocking, a mistake he would come to regret. "So it's true," he muttered, glancing around the new space. "You're the one giving orders now." Adaeze didn't look up immediately. She finished typing a sentence before raising her eyes. "It's true," she said, her voice like satin over steel. "And next time knock. This isn't your girlfriend's bedroom." The jab hit him like ice water. He shifted awkwardly. "Pamela, she lied to me. About a lot of things. She used me." Adaeze didn't blink. "And you let her. You thought my loyalty was weakness, but it was just love in the wrong direction." She stood, walked around the desk, and stood close enough for him to smell her perfume. "Now that you've seen what becoming looks like, I hope it burns every time you remember what you lost." And with that, she turned and left him standing in the doorway, ashamed, exposed, and irrelevant. Chuka's life was unraveling. What started as a thrill with Pamela had spiraled into a web of toxicity. After Pamela's firing, he was called in for a performance review. His numbers had dropped, and his behavior was no longer considered acceptable by HR. Clients had filed subtle complaints about his tardiness and poor communication. And now, with Adaeze in a senior position, the shame of answering indirectly to her was too much for his fragile ego. His pride crumbled quietly, and for the first time in years, Chuka began to understand the weight of the mistake he had made. His nights were filled with alcohol and regret, and every time he tried to reach out to Adaeze, whether through text, email, or subtle passes in the hallway, he was met with silence. A silence that screamed louder than anything she could have ever said. It became clear to him that she had truly moved on, not with someone else, but within herself. Meanwhile, Pamela was living in chaos. After her dismissal, she tried to latch onto another executive from another firm, but no one wanted to associate with her. Her reputation was ruined, not because of rumors, but because of proof. The same manipulation she had once used to steal Chuka had now become her downfall. She messaged Adaeze anonymously, begging for a second chance at friendship, claiming she was under pressure, that she never meant to fall for Chuka. But Adaeze didn't even open the message. Forgiveness was divine, but some bridges, once burned, were better left in ashes. Pamela's world shrank. The woman who once sparkled at events, flaunted luxury, and walked with pride now stayed indoors, hiding from the eyes that once adored her and the lips that now gossiped. What was once envy had turned into pity, and no amount of apologies could reverse that. Emeka, however, watched all of this from a quiet place. He never interfered with Adaeze's past, but it was clear that her presence moved something inside him. He started spending more time with her outside of work, coffee runs that turned into shared breakfasts, strategy sessions that extended into early dinners. Yet, nothing about it was rushed. Emeka was patient. He was still healing in his own way, but every time he looked at Adaeze, he saw someone who reminded him that pain didn't have to harden a person, that softness could still exist after suffering. One rainy evening, after a long meeting, he walked her to her car. She turned to thank him, and their hands touched, brief, electric. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But as she drove off, Adaeze smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because of the touch, but because she no longer felt cold inside. Something warm was blooming again. Slowly, gently, unshakably. Days passed, and that unspoken bond between Adaeze and Emeka began to deepen. It was never loud or obvious, but it was present in everything they did. The way he waited for her to enter meetings before starting. The way she brought him tea without being asked. The way their eyes found each other in crowded rooms. One evening, after they finalized a major client deal, Emeka invited her for a quiet dinner to celebrate. Not as her boss, as a man who had grown to respect, admire, and care for her. She hesitated at first, unsure if crossing that line would be a mistake. But her heart overruled her doubt, and she accepted. The restaurant was simple, elegant, just like him. They spoke about everything but work. Childhood stories, favorite books, regrets, dreams. And in that quiet space, something sacred emerged, not passion, but peace. Emeka didn't rush. He didn't make grand speeches or promises. He simply looked her in the eye and said, "I know what it feels like to be abandoned. And I know what it takes to build something after the ruin. I don't want to save you. I just want to stand beside you, if you'll let me." Adaeze's eyes welled with tears, not because she was sad, but because no man had ever said such words to her without trying to possess her. She nodded slowly. No dramatic confessions. No romantic clichés. Just mutual respect, deep affection, and a decision to walk gently into something real. From that night, everything changed, but nothing was rushed. They still maintained professionalism in the office, but outside, they were two people learning to love without fear. It was fragile. It was beautiful. And it was finally hers. Love that didn't break her. Love that didn't ask her to shrink. Back at the office, whispers began to rise, but Adaeze didn't care anymore. She had risen from betrayal, walked through fire, and survived. She had no apologies left to give. Her loyalty had been tested, and her grace had spoken for her. One morning, Emeka stood in the middle of the boardroom and introduced her as his partner, both professionally and personally. The room went silent. Chuka, seated in the far corner, felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. Adaeze stood confidently, her expression serene. She didn't gloat. She didn't glance in his direction. She simply said, "Thank you. Let's begin." That moment wasn't just a title shift. It was justice without vengeance. For the first time, the woman who was once cast aside was now seated at the very table where decisions were made. And she had earned every inch of it, not by revenge, but by rising. The evening was quiet, bathed in the golden hue of a setting sun that streamed through the windows of Emeka's private home. He had invited Adaeze over for dinner again, this time more personal, more intentional. His home was filled with quiet warmth, minimalist art, earthy tones, and the gentle hum of jazz music in the background. It felt nothing like Chuka's chaos, or the old pain that used to haunt her. As they finished eating, Emeka stood and walked to the center table, reaching into a small drawer. Adaeze watched curiously, unsure of what was happening. Then he returned and placed a tiny velvet box before her. Her heartbeat slowed. He didn't open it immediately. He sat, took her hand, and spoke with the softness of a man who had nothing to prove. "You've walked through fire without bitterness, Adaeze. You've taught me more about grace than any boardroom or book ever could. I don't want to just be the man who stood beside you while you healed. I want to be the man who walks with you into everything you're becoming." Adaeze couldn't breathe. She stared at the box, her hand trembling as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Nothing flashy, just a golden circle with a small diamond, clear and unpretentious, just like her. Her eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched as Emeka waited, not anxiously, but with peace, like he already knew her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "I used to think no one would ever see me again. Not fully. Not after everything. But you did. You saw me even when I was invisible." She nodded, tears spilling freely. "Yes, Emeka. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her hand, not with possession, but with reverence. And just like that, she was no longer the girl who was left. She was the woman chosen, not for what she lost, but for who she had become. That night, Adaeze lay in bed, staring at her hand, the ring catching the moonlight like a silent testimony. She remembered everything: the betrayal, the hunger, the cold nights, the whispers. She thought of Pamela, who once said, "You deserve the best," while stealing what little she had. She thought of Chuka, who had once told her she was too ordinary to be special. And then she thought of Emeka, who never tried to change her, only to walk beside her. She smiled softly, touched her ring, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Her journey wasn't perfect, and there were still wounds that hadn't fully closed. But she had arrived at a place no pain could touch, a place where love didn't come at the cost of her peace. She didn't need the world's validation. She had found the one soul who saw her clearly, and that was enough. The next morning, the company held its quarterly leadership briefing. Senior executives, department heads, and select staff gathered in the grand conference room. Adaeze entered with Emeka, no longer just as assistant or department head, but now introduced officially as his fiancée and co-chair of the strategic board. The announcement was subtle but powerful. Emeka spoke gently but firmly. "This company believes in people who rise not by connections, but by character. Adaeze will now co-lead our expansion strategy and executive board operations." Gasps rippled through the room. Most clapped. A few looked shocked. And, in the far left corner, Chuka froze. The title she now held meant she had direct influence over operational decisions, including departments where Chuka worked. He looked around, face flushed, as realization dawned on him. The woman he once dismissed was now one of the highest-ranking figures in his career life. After the meeting, Adaeze sat in her new office, sleek, glass walls, private balcony, and her name etched into the door. It still felt surreal, but not undeserved. She had worked for this, not overnight, not through manipulation, but through grit, discipline, and heart. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Chuka. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, eyes full of shame. "Can I speak with you?" he asked. She didn't offer him a seat. "Speak." He shifted uncomfortably. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For hurting you. For not seeing you. For being foolish." Adaeze studied him. He looked older, somehow, not physically, but spiritually, like the weight of his own mistakes had finally caught up. "Thank you," she replied calmly. "But you don't owe me an apology. You owe it to the version of yourself you killed when you chose betrayal over loyalty." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." She smiled faintly. "Yes. And I found someone who never saw me as a stepping stone." As he turned to leave, she added, "Tsuka, I don't hate you. I don't even think about you anymore." That was the final blow. He walked out quietly, defeated in a way deeper than professional failure. He had been demoted weeks earlier, and now he realized that even dignity was beyond his reach. Adaeze sat back in her chair, exhaled deeply, and turned her attention to her agenda for the day. That moment wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. She had finally looked her past in the eye and found it powerless. She wasn't just Emika's fiancée. She was now Chuka's boss, not in authority alone, but in grace, in peace, and in self-worth. She didn't climb a ladder to shame anyone. She climbed it to find herself. And now that she had, no one, not even her past, could bring her down again. The months that followed were full of growth, not just in Adaeze's career, but in her sense of self. Her love for Emika deepened in a way that surprised even her. It wasn't the fireworks kind of love. It was the kind that showed up in little things: a hot cup of tea on her desk when she worked late, a text that said, "You're doing great, don't forget to eat," or the way he'd slip his hand into hers at the end of a stressful day. He didn't complete her. She had learned she was already whole, but he complimented her in the places she never knew needed support. Together, they began overseeing the company's upcoming international expansion, and Adaeze was now a familiar name in boardrooms she had once only dreamed of entering. But one thing remained unfinished, a conversation she had never had, with the person who caused the deepest wound: Pamela. One afternoon, while visiting a community center for a corporate outreach, Adaeze spotted Pamela sitting quietly in a corner. She had become a shadow of her former self: dull eyes, worn clothes, no trace of the flashy girl who once dripped with envy and entitlement. Pamela saw her too, and their eyes met. For a moment, time paused. Adaeze walked over slowly. Pamela stood and opened her mouth, but words failed her. "I know," Adaeze said softly. "You don't have to say anything." Pamela shook her head, tears forming. "I just want you to know. I was broken. I was jealous. I thought taking what you had would fill what I lacked, but it only emptied me more." Adaeze sighed. "I know pain does strange things to people, but it doesn't excuse betrayal. You didn't just take a man. You destroyed trust. You killed a friendship that once felt like home." Pamela cried openly now, wiping her eyes. "I've lost everything." Adaeze placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No. You lost the things that were never meant for you. Maybe now you can find yourself." She turned and walked away, not in anger, not in pride, but in release. The burden of old wounds lifted as she stepped into the sunlight. That evening, she sat with Emika on their balcony, her head resting on his shoulder as the sky turned orange with dusk. "I saw Pamela today," she whispered. Emika nodded. "How did it feel?" She closed her eyes. "Like the final chapter of a book I've been carrying for too long." He kissed her forehead and held her hand. "Then it's time to write a new story." Adaeze smiled, heart light, spirit free. The girl who had once begged for love now sat beside a man who gave it freely. The woman who had been broken now stood tall, leading, loving, and living fully. She had faced her past and walked out with her crown intact. Chuka's spiral into obscurity was silent but merciless. After Adaeze's promotion and Pamela's firing, his days at the company were numbered. Though he tried to hold on to relevance, his lack of vision and poor work ethic became more obvious under Adaeze's direct oversight. His supervisors filed reports of his absenteeism, missed deadlines, and careless mistakes. No one defended him anymore. He was no longer the charming guy people wanted to please. He was now just a bitter man drowning in his own consequences. The final blow came during an audit when it was discovered that Chuka had submitted manipulated reports to cover up underperformance. There was no need for a hearing. His dismissal was swift and cold. HR escorted him out, while Adaeze, sitting behind her sleek glass desk, watched without a word. She didn't gloat. She didn't even blink. Chuka wasn't worth her rage anymore. He was a closed chapter, now being shredded by karma's hand. After his dismissal, Chuka struggled to find new work. Word of his incompetence and behavior had spread quietly through corporate circles, especially after being dismissed from a prestigious firm. Pamela, now barely surviving, refused to pick his calls. The two former lovers, who once laughed at Adaeze's pain, had now become enemies in their own ruined little world. He tried to start a small delivery business, but without discipline, it failed. His old friends had moved on. Family, tired of his entitlement, offered no help. One day, he saw a billboard advertising a women's empowerment conference, and there, smiling, beside Emeka, was Adaeze, now a woman whose story inspired thousands. He stood in the street, staring at the poster, defeated. He remembered mocking her ambitions, laughing at her tears, and sleeping beside her best friend without guilt. But now even the air she breathed was above his reach. The same Adaeze he once dismissed now existed in a world far too high for him to touch. Meanwhile, Adaeze had become a force. She was not just Emeka's partner. She was now a respected name in corporate strategy across the region. Her grace and excellence made her both admired and envied. She still lived simply, still walked humbly, and still mentored young women quietly, often anonymously funding struggling girls through school. But she never sought the spotlight. Every time people asked about her rise, she would smile and say, "Pain taught me to see clearly. Love taught me to choose gently." Emeka continued to be her anchor, never overshadowing her, always standing beside her like a silent lion. Together, they led the company with strength and compassion. And while Chuka and Pamela roamed forgotten, searching for crumbs of stability, Adaeze dined with kings, walked with dignity, and slept with peace. She never once wished them harm, because true power doesn't scream or destroy. It simply outgrows everything that once tried to bury it. The wedding was nothing extravagant, yet every detail breathed elegance. Adaeze wore a white lace gown, regal, soft, and graceful, just like the journey that led her here. The ceremony was held in a quiet garden, surrounded by only those who had walked with her in truth. Emeka stood at the altar, eyes full of reverence, waiting, not like a man waiting to claim something, but like a man receiving a gift he didn't feel entitled to, but had prayed for every day. As Adaeze walked toward him, each step felt like a closing of 1,000 wounds. She wasn't marrying to escape her past. She was marrying because she had healed. The applause that greeted her wasn't for her beauty alone. It was for her strength, her courage, and the silent victory she carried in her spirit. When she took Emeka's hand, they didn't just say vows, they exchanged healing. After the ceremony, they didn't throw a grand reception. Instead, they shared a quiet dinner under fairy lights, surrounded by laughter, music, and heartfelt toasts. During Emeka's speech, he held Adaeze's hand and said, "In you, I found what I never thought I'd find again, not just love, but clarity. You taught me that rising from ashes is not about vengeance, but about becoming the light itself." Adaeze didn't cry. She just smiled, content, knowing this love wasn't built on desperation, but on mutual respect. As they danced slowly to an old jazz tune, she whispered into his ear, "Thank you for loving a woman who was once shattered." Emeka pulled her closer and replied, "Thank you for becoming whole without waiting to be rescued." Around them, no cameras flashed, no grand announcements were made, but something sacred had been written into the atmosphere. And Adaeze, for the first time in her life, felt completely seen, completely safe. Years later, people would ask about Adaeze's story. Young girls would cry after hearing it, mothers would nod in respect, and men would rethink how they treated the women who stood by them. But Adaeze never told it with bitterness. She never named names. She simply said, "Don't fear heartbreak. It's not the end. Sometimes, it's just a fire your gold needs." Her story was never about Chuka or Pamela. It was about endurance, patience, and the kind of victory that doesn't need to be loud to be unforgettable. She became a symbol, not of revenge, but of restoration. And as she sat beside Emeka in their quiet garden years later, watching their children play, she smiled at the journey. She had lost everything once, but now she had something no one could ever take: peace. The girl who was once thrown away had become a queen, not because someone crowned her, but because she rose and never looked back. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.